It should be better now. All right, so now we have this one. So everything should be fine now. All right, so all right, perfect. So then I would say, let's get started. So who wants to give us the introduction?
I can go.
Yep, that sounds great.
So Blazor is shipping in build as part of build in May. As part of it, like it uses WebAssembly, which currently lives in most of the source code currently lives in the mono repo. Some of it will move over to the runtime repo in 5.0. When it does HTTP, the underlying transport that it uses is the fetch API. That's a browser-specific API. And fetch has like a couple of interesting properties that like users might want to configure. So if you want to do like cores, or if you want to do like caching or integrity checks and things like that, it's fairly common to want to configure this. So this API was basically about trying to surface some of these properties in a way that .NET users can use when they're programming in WebAssembly.
This proposal here, Pranav, is this a reflection of what is already implemented inside Mono today, or is this a different take on it?
So we have an ongoing PR that attempts to change some of these things to sort of map this, but based on the feedback that we receive from here, or maybe like even alternate designs, we might change that current implementation.
I have two high-level questions. One, I imagine there's more. I imagine we'll walk through the individual members here, but I imagine there's more customization that's actually possible with the fetch API than is exposed here. And so I'm wondering if A, that's true, and if B, it is true, how we arrived at these 5 things to configure. And then my second question is just a naming one on the handler itself. I'm still a little confused about when we're choosing to use WebAssembly versus something related to the browser or the specific API that's being used. If we're referring to WebAssembly in general as the architecture or the instruction set, it's a little strange to me that we'd include that in the name of the handler.
So I think like of the APIs that Fetch exposes, there was only one additional one, which I didn't bring up. I can pull that up. Like it's in the linked issue, in the link here that says Fetch API. But most of the other ones were there, and there's no reason. I just picked the ones that we sort of needed as part of Blazor, and I think were commonly used by applications. Let me go look it up. And so I think the one that was missing is like referrer and referrer policy, which I haven't seen like used commonly. But then now that I look at it, like this also keep alive, which might be interesting to like bring over. Things like, and some of the other properties that like the Fetch API uses are exposed differently. So for example, like you can specify like a way to abort the current request. Like in this case, like you would just use a cancellation token on the like on the HTTP send async instead, and like the implementation sort of converts it into that option.
Okay.
Same way like you would use like the HTTP request message .headers or the content.headers. So like set the headers property. These were the ones that sort of like didn't really map well to like .NET concepts. So they're exposed.
Do you think there's a reasonable way of having a loosely typed get out of like jail's thing where, you know, there's a dictionary that you can use to pass other arbitrary parameters?
That would be interesting because like, so for one, like browsers do tend to change maybe more frequently than us or like out of band from us. So it might be interesting for us to sort of consider it just in case like they add like one other option and, you know, users don't have to wait an entire year or so before they can start like using it. And yeah, and like sometimes browsers also tend to like bring in experimental features that might be interesting to for an application developer. So having a loosely typed option that basically gives you get out of the jail free might be interesting.
Okay.
For the
handlers like HTTP client handler, sockets HTTP handler, Win HTTP handler, they all have a properties property that's an iDictionary from string to object. If that would be useful, I mean, for the most part, they don't use it, but I think they were added with the idea that it could be an escape hatch like that. Maybe it would make sense here as well.
Well, unfortunately, we would need to know which subset of the keys to serialize and send over to the JavaScript side. So we probably would need something that was more clearly a dictionary of fetch options rather than other things, which might not even be serializable.
Sure. It could be, I mean, you could imagine various schemes around it. It could be that you come up with a naming convention for keys. It could be that there is a fetch options entry in that properties, which then, you know, is itself another dictionary, or it could be something entirely else, entirely different. I just wanted to point out that they did exist in some fashion.
Yep, cool.
And so for the naming itself, like I think there was like some offline discussion about it, and but like we've had like multiple naming issues about this, and I just went with the one that was like suggested in like the offline discussion, but like it's not clear to me like this is the best name. Like browser HTTP handler sounds just about fine to me.
Yeah, my other concern is you have very generic names for the enums, right? You have request cache, request credentials, request mode, but they're all specific to this handler. And all of these things are dumped into the namespace that everybody else is using, which is already pretty busy. So it might be worthwhile to either have a naming convention for the enum so they're all tied together, or if you're convinced that these enums are used outside of the WebAssembly handler, then using the current names is also fine. But if they're very specific to this handler, then I'd either have a prefix for those enums, or I would maybe even put the whole stuff in its own namespace. Because I mean, the other question is, if it's just these 4 types, I think it's fine. But to Steven's earlier point, like if we extend the API service over time and then eventually we have 10, 15, 20 types, then having them all in the root namespace might be a bad idea.
So would it be something like system.HTTP WebAssembly or system.HTTP browser? Like, do we?
I guess. Yeah, I would just say, like, I mean, whatever we call it. I mean, I think if we call it WebAssembly HTTP handler, I think it's reasonable the namespace is called WebAssembly. Like whatever name we pick, whether it's browser or WebAssembly, I would just use it as the prefix for HTTP handler and as the name of the namespace.
Okay.
Would this be usable in like an Electron environment?
It really depends on how exactly you're hosting .NET inside Electron. So if you are using Electron to open an HTML file that contains a Blazor application, then yeah, it would work identically because it would just load on WebAssembly. On the other hand, if you are using the way that we've suggested to host Blazor in Electron, then WebAssembly is not involved at all in that situation, and so you wouldn't use it there.
So like another sort of thing that Corey pointed out in the comments, because there were a couple of comments that he had, was that all of these options are per request basis. So like basically when you do a fetch, they're all per request options, versus like the handler is more long lived. And his suggestion was to like have we considered like using a derive HTTP request message where you could configure it? But like obviously that has its downfalls too.
Oh, hold on, Pranav. Maybe I'm misremembering how these things wire up together. Are you saying in the default case, a person can create an HTTP handler and then use it to send multiple requests?
Yes, because it's tied to the HTTP client instance itself.
In that case, setting something like an integrity doesn't really make sense, because that you would never have the same integrity value for unrelated requests.
Right.
Yeah. I believe the request message also has a dictionary of string to objects. That might be usable here too.
I think that was.
Sorry, I was going to say, you can
been
imagine having like instead of having the actual properties, you can imagine having static keys that were used to index into that or something.
That is precisely where this entire thing started.
Okay.
So we originally, that was the exact implementation we originally proposed, but the stringly typedness of it, people were not happy about.
Got it.
But, you know, there are good reasons for it, and I still think that's quite a sensible approach.
So another approach is to have a type derived from HTTP request message. I don't think we've done that yet.
Okay.
I mean, that would completely change the way that you work with the type, wouldn't it? Because you can't use HTTP client to build the messages for you anymore.
Yeah, but presumably if you are setting these per request, then whoever's making the request has to know that they're working with this type already.
Yes, correct.
So what is with something like integrity, to Steve's point, like, does that mean that people will not be using the convenience methods on HTTP client?
Not if they want to set these properties.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, just from the get-go, if we expected these to be tweaked for every request that gets sent, putting them on the handler is not the right place.
Okay.
So which are these? Is it just integrity, or is this true for all the properties that you put in the handler?
Well, the underlying fetch API is based, like the JavaScript fetch API, is based around the idea that you set all the options you want for every request that you send. There isn't any concept of anywhere to store these options for reuse. And so it does make sense for us to reflect that kind of design on the .NET side for the same reasons that it's designed that way on JavaScript. There's no reason why any two requests should have the same request cache policy or the same request mode, same integrity.
In that case, I would probably go with a different approach. I would probably do a separate namespace. I would put an extension type there that just defines extension methods over the request message, and then maybe have some convenience APIs that are directly against HTTP handler that, I don't know, are named appropriately, get with integrity or something like this, where you'd already set these things. So you don't have to construct a message for every single thing by hand. But then maybe we don't even need new types. Maybe we can just define everything as extension methods, and then the underlying thing could be effectively stringly typed, right? But developers don't have to deal with that.
That is precisely the original proposal. Yeah.
Yeah, we started with that, and then I think like the concern was that like it didn't feel strongly typed enough.
But I don't think that's a good justification. Like, there's nothing not strongly typed about it. All the APIs that developers use are regular methods that feel as strongly typed as anything else. It's just an internal implementation detail that we're representing stuff in a dictionary.
I mean, you could have an options type, right? I mean, it's just that, instead of exposing them all as set methods on the handler, you can also just have an options type, and then you have a, WebAssembly options where you put all the things as regular properties, and then you only pass in this option in one of those extension methods, and then this thing does whatever it does, right? So it could feel very similar to regular properties on the types, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Do you mean you define some type, let's call it fetch options, for example, and then you're saying the underlying representation is that the HTTP request message has a properties entry called fetch options or something that is of type fetch options. And then we've got a bunch of extension methods that deal with creating that entry in the dictionary if it doesn't exist and then mutating its properties.
Sort of. What I basically would suggest is we would have an extension method over message and some extension methods over the existing HTTP client that effectively take this option class, and then effectively the user would define fetch options, and then they can either share it across multiple requests and just pass in the same instance every single time, or they can new up one every single time and then pass that to the get method that has an overload, the post method that has an overload, and maybe the message itself has a set fetch options method defined.
They all sound good to me.
That seems like, at least that's very closely to what you said, right? If you actually think, then I don't know what the JavaScript API looks like, but I assume you have effectively the equivalent of get and post, and then you pass in the options either directly or as already an options type, right?
Well, on the JavaScript side, it's just called fetch, and you specify method as one of the options. But yeah, it's more or less the same.
So that's basically then the equivalent of send, right? But yeah. And maybe that's what we do then.
So what does that give us versus deriving from HTTP request message?
It would be very similar, right? I mean, because even if you extend the message directly, you generally don't want to construct the messages by hand, but you still probably want some convenience overload direct in HTTP client where you can just say get and then pass in whatever you want to pass in, right? Rather than having to say send and then construct the message, set the method, and do all the other stuff that is like 4 lines of code, right?
We would still likely have a derived type or some scheme involving properties, since it would have to work its way down to the underlying handler. You're just saying it wouldn't be public, right?
Yeah, or we basically do what you suggest, right? We have a generic property back somewhere that we introduce on the base, so we don't have to do crazy gymnastics elsewhere, right?
I think the convenience methods like the get and post won't allow you to set any of these currently. Like we would need all new overloads for those. So the only way someone would be able to set any of these is to use the full, construct their own message and call send.
If I understood correctly, the extension method proposal was to add like get overloads, get async overloads that took these as parameters. Was that the proposal?
Yeah.
I see.
For the common ones, right? And then I would still have a send one that just takes the entire options class, right? So that you always have the ability to pass in everything, whatever we add in the future.
Could you click on the fetch API link? I'm curious what the actual browser API looks like.
So maybe you want to click on the web, that one, because that has the actual. Sorry, you're right, Howard. The fetch interfaces, like the first link under fetch interfaces.
This one here, window worker, yeah.
Yep, because that's like the actual method.
Yeah, there you go. So everything that's listed under init, method, headers, body, and so on, those are all the options.
And I think like further down, they might have an example of what this ends up looking like.
I see.
I guess the downside to the extension method approach is if we do expect this to evolve, that's easy for JavaScript. It's not quite as easy for a signature with fixed number of arguments.
Well, that's what I said. Like if we would just have a fetch options class, right, then we just add the send overload that just takes that one, right? And then right. As we add properties, you always get it in. I mean, I'm still not entirely sure what your implementation does. Like, I mean, how do you plumb the stuff through?
Well, that's the thing. This will end up at some point. This needs to be on the HTTP request message because that's what gets handed off to the handler. So somehow this ends up either in a known property name on the HTTP request message that this particular handler looks for under the covers, or you have a derived type of HTTP request message that this handler looks, tries to cast it to that thing to fetch the options off of it. But in some way, shape, or form, they have to end up on that request message object.
I see.
And how common is it for people to actually set these?
It's not super common. I would say we're talking probably like, it's not just a few percent, but it's not 50% either. It's going to be, I don't know, like imagine a quarter of the time you want to do something like this. And there'll be certain people whose applications, for whatever reason, require them to do this every single time because, their server requires them to. But they've got their own reasons to. And in that case, we would just say, like, you have to make your own helper methods that wrap, get, and post and such in your own ways.
Would it be worth the handler can have defaults?
I don't know. Like we've kind of did that in the past, and it's confused people. Like we did it with just a static, which was awful. But even if it was on the handler, that's kind of it's the same kind of thing as a static. It's just a bit more scoped than that. And unless you've got a good reason for wanting to reuse these values, then the value of it is a bit small. Whereas what you just said about making a fetch options object that you can reuse if you want to, that perhaps is a little more obvious.
Yeah, I think I'd be inclined to either to not have, personally, I'd be inclined to not have extension methods and just have either a fetch options bag that we put into a known named property on the message or a derived property type, both of them named appropriately to connote that they're only relevant to when you're operating in a scenario where you're using this underlying handler. If we expose the extension methods, I'd be a little concerned that we'd have to make the name so unwieldy that it would just be this long gibberish thing because we wouldn't want someone calling it outside of this domain.
So that's why I would put them in a different namespace, right? That's why I would say we would have systemnet.http. Let's say WebAssembly. And so you would have to have a using for that namespace in order to see those extension methods.
Yeah.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, though. Like, my concern with that, if you derive from, I think handler is fine because the handler is the thing that you have in one place, right? Deriving from message seems odd because it will break compositionality, right? So, for example, all the extension methods that we have defined right now for, the serialization stuff, there's code samples in them where people basically just, hand create messages, right? And like basically everybody who has a new statement right now for a message to do some advanced stuff, they would now have to change it to new WebAssembly message or something, right? Which
but they'd have to
may
change
not compose.
If they wanted to use the extension methods, they'd have to change the calls to the current ones to be the extension methods instead. Either way, they're changing them.
I guess that's fair, yeah. You have to
it does depend a bit on the scenario.
Yes. Yeah.
If someone's got some library that produces HTTP request messages somehow, then they would be able to use that with the extension methods, but they wouldn't be able to use it if there was a different type. But I don't really know that there are very common cases where people do that.
So that's why I'm wondering if default values on the handler might be valuable, because all of the existing code that uses HTTP client, if all you want to do is set, a cache value for all of your requests, then your code could be portable across multiple handlers.
Yeah,
like the JSON extensions would all work.
I mean, caching seems still somewhat specific, but I think credentials is one of those things that you probably would want. Right? I could see that being something people want to do.
Yeah. I agree that having some way of doing defaults could be useful for some people, but that's more nice to have. That having a way of doing stuff on a per request basis is the essential thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I'm fine not having the statics. I agree with Stephen, though. I think that extension methods probably aren't going to be very useful here. or at least they're not going to have the effect of keeping the same composition that we have today.
Well, but if extension methods are just there to give you compile safety on setting the property names, and then they're just shoving it in the dictionary, that would still provide the value with being implementation detail stringly typed, but most people's code samples would be strongly typed.
Yes, it's more of a nice to have, not a need to have, though.
Right.
It depends what alternative you're suggesting. What would be the usage pattern if they don't exist?
My preference would be a derived type off of HTTP request message.
Okay. Well, if that derived type is the thing that carries the information, then the extension methods are irrelevant, right? Because if you've already created your HTTP request message and it's not that type, then you've got no way of doing this.
Well, you could say that the extension method is just a final by HTTP handler for common operations, right? You could have a send async that takes the options as arguments, right? And then that just constructs the derived type of the HTTP request message, and then that just passes it on.
So you're saying the derived type there is not a magic type as far as the underlying handler is concerned. The derived type is just a shorthand way of populating the properties dictionary.
Well, it is magic in the sense that that's what the handler would look for, right? If the handler have to process a message, they would just try to downcast it to the WebAssembly request message and then see whether the properties are set there. And if they're not, then you would just use the defaults.
Okay, so that being the case, nobody could ever use this with a regular HTTP request message. And that being the case, what are the extension methods doing? What are they extending extensions of?
HTTP client. They would just be send async or post async, just as a shorthand.
Oh, got it. Yeah, I thought you were. Yeah.
So they're not required. They would just make the common case slightly shorter, right? So that people don't have to construct the message.
All right.
But yeah, it probably doesn't buy you much. It just makes probably the hello world look slightly more appealing.
Yeah. Well, I would consider the derived type to be sufficient. It does mean that everyone has to write, 4 lines of code to do this, but it's uncommon enough that people
that's the thing that I don't have a good handle on. I would just say that given that we just were asked to do the extension methods for JSON serialization, it's also 4 lines of code most of the time, right? Or for many of the things, right? And yeah, if you write it often enough, it's annoying, right? So if you think that all these things are rare enough, then I think that's fine.
So what is the common content type that you would use with this? Would it be JSON?
No, this is for any kind of request.
Yeah, I mean, it can work for anything, obviously, but what is the common one? Because extension methods or a derived request type, neither of them would support the new JSON extensions, right? We would have to add additional extension methods that worked for JSON and this, and it's going to kind of balloon into this large thing. It seems like if the common way of using this is to just send some JSON somewhere, that you might need to construct the request yourself anyway.
Well, I mean, you could say that, if what Steve just said is right, then you would just say, okay, then we would just say the common case is you don't have to pass anything in. So the regular HTTP client messages and methods will work for you. If you want to, and then also, of course, our extension methods will work just fine too. But now let's say you need to set the cache policy or need to set credentials. If you wouldn't use JSON, you would just construct the WebAssembly request message by hand. And if you do use JSON, it just means you call the extension methods that we have over, the content or whatever we have, right? So you can just basically read or send as a one-liner, right? You either set the content as JSON content, or you basically say when you're reading, you get the message and then you just say, read as JSON, right? Rather than using the extension methods defined over HTTP client. So they still compose It just means that it's all predicated on the fact that it is rare, right? If it's very, very common that people need to pass in these things, and you need top-level extension methods on HTTP client that deal with that, then I would agree with you, then it falls apart. If we think that most of the time we wouldn't even define these extension methods over HTTP client because we expect the vast majority of people get away with not setting these properties, and it's a very rare thing to set them, and the way you set them is by using the message, then I think it composes well enough.
I wasn't trying to suggest it's so rare that, you'd not see it in the wild. I think, I was estimating before, like maybe a third of the time people want to do this. I think it's common enough that people will demand it. Is it really impractical to have a set of extra overloads on the HTTP JSON APIs that are going to work with this in some way?
No, they probably would be fine. It's just a question now, dependency matrix, right? Because I don't exactly, I mean, it depends on how these things are shipped, right? So if you ship this thing as a standalone NuGet package, and we ship ours as a standalone NuGet package, then ours would have to depend on yours, for example, right? That's just the end result of that.
Yep.
And it also means if ours wants to go inbox, yours has to go inbox as well.
Correct.
But yeah, I think it's fine if we just have to add overload that takes some data. That would be fine, I think.
And technically speaking, they wouldn't need to depend on each other. They would just need similar extension shapes and a lot of repeated code. So depending on what our goals were, we could work around it.
I'm wondering if we're going to find similar issues with other handlers as we think about more about iOS and Android and whatnot. If we're going to find that this is a common pattern of needing to supply additional handler-specific data with each request. Mm-hmm. And if so, it's one thing, I think, to create a specialized request message or keys into a property bag. It's another thing to duplicate a whole bunch of methods for issuing requests for each.
I mean, I can think of, this is maybe slightly derailing the conversation, but I can think of cases where that's true today, where users have the expectation that they can or should be able to configure various HTTP client handler related settings on a per request basis, and it causes them a lot of pain.
Yeah, like it sort of feels, taking Steve's thing and running with it, like we won't possibly want like an options builder type, or we just say it's the dictionary, and then we take the existing HTTP client methods and we add overloads that take, a dictionary to merge in with the dictionary that it puts on the request as it builds it. So then you would have your application model specific properties that you need to add, and then using a strongly typed builder or whatever, and then it merges them in on the request on the fly. It still won't help things like the JSON extension methods unless we also add the options pass through on those, which we can certainly do, but that's probably or possibly a more extensible thing if we think we're going to need to do this 6 or 7 times.
The other kind of design shape that occurs to me is, following on from the options builder thing you mentioned there, if all of these different get and post methods were conventionally not the thing that actually issues the request, but rather they're something that returns an HTTP request message. So your normal usage would be var something equals await my client dot get blah blah blah, and then you'd have dot send async after it. And if you want to, in between the get and the send async, you could chain on as many other builder calls as you like, extension methods that do handler specific things. I know it's probably too late to that.
I mean you could in theory still add those.
Yeah, I think that would be fine. I mean, the question is also how this stuff eventually composes, right? If the expectation is that ultimately you have effectively what amounts to either a key value bag somewhere at the very bottom, and then if the expectation is you construct the handler that knows about certain things, and then in the message you just put in whatever you want, then I think that's a fine design. And then effectively that means we just have to have some sort of base type that all these options can derive from. And then, every single method that takes, everything is specialized method effectively that we currently have. We just take an optional argument that is effectively whatever additional things you want to stuff in, and that just munches it on the underlying message handler. So not message handler, underlying message. And then the handler can extract it from there. I'm not sure I would like to do dictionaries in general because they also don't seem to be super cheap, right?
I mean, we can make some optimizations to make them a little less allocated, but there would be an expense.
I mean, we could just say like we have an abstraction, right? Some sort of type that everybody derives from, and this can have a public API that effectively allows you to inspect keys and get values out of it. The underlying thing doesn't actually have to be a dictionary, but it could be some smart thing that doesn't allocate a lot of stuff. So we can probably still solve that. And I think generally speaking, also people don't like dictionaries, as Steve said, right? It's thanks to generics, it's not very pretty usually. So you probably want to hide the dictionary anyways. Yeah, I think that design would scale, right? I mean, I can easily see this being also very composable.
So when you have these special handlers, it's all very handler-specific functionality. If you have this pseudo dictionary type, let's say, and I pass in a, Xamarin Android handler option into a WebAssembly handler, what would the behavior be?
Honestly,
but is it possible that we... Okay, so ignoring it is one thing. Is it possible we could make it throw? Because if the HTTP client that you're using internally constructs a WebAssembly HTTP message, then when the extension method tries to do some Android-specific stuff, it will try to downcast the message to an Android message, and the cast will fail, so it will just throw.
Yeah, the problem, I think, to the earlier point, is that my concern with doing it as literally deriving from the messages is that can't compose, right? At any given point in time, you can only have one of them, right? And that's the problem with class libraries, where class libraries themselves construct the message already for you, right? Then you have to change the mechanics, right? Which is the nice thing with this, advanced options concept, where basically everybody just takes these advanced options that are effectively just, set on the underlying message, and then the handler just has to extract known keys effectively, right? And then you could even have a concept and say certain options are required, so if the handler doesn't know about them, the handler is supposed to throw. Or you could just say some things are just optional things that are nice to have, right? If the underlying handler knows what to do with it, great. If it doesn't, then nothing bad happens.
Well, I'm not sure that it's completely the case that this won't compose. So when in any given situation, you have one specific handler involved. So you've either got the WebAssembly one, or you've got an Android one, or whatever. There's an actual underlying technology, and that technology knows what features it supports. So if it is able to define a concrete type that knows about those capabilities, then you can have as many interfaces on that as you want to represent all the different kinds of extension methods that are applicable to it. So you can have the I accept fetch options interface and the I accept Android options interface. And then only, when you try and do the cast to the relevant interface type, we'll see whether or not your handler supports this kind of option.
So who would implement those interfaces?
Whoever implements the HTTP request message.
So there would be a handler.create options method, create options builder method that would, throw if you add an incompatible option.
Well, so I would imagine a message, an extension method called something like set fetch options, or even more specifically set integrity or something like that. And the implementation of that would take the HTTP request message and it would try to cast it to an I fetch HTTP request message or something like that, so that it can start setting some strongly typed properties on it. And if that cast doesn't work, then we realize that this type of HTTP request message doesn't support those types of options.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with like visualizing how this composes. I mean, like, so imagine you have a library that does OAuth, right? And the library basically does the thing already for you, where it constructs, an HTTP client, it constructs, messages, whatever, right? And then, at the root of the library, you're also allowed to pass in your own handler as the escape hatch, right? So now you imagine you try to use this thing in WASM, right? So you would basically pass in WebAssembly HTTP handler to this thing. But now this library has to be aware of WebAssembly in the sense that it has to be able to accept WebAssembly specific options somehow, right?
Is the library responsible for creating the request messages, or is the handler responsible for creating those messages?
The library.
I mean,
Okay.
So today that's the library, right? Because literally people just new them up, right? I mean, you could introduce a factory method, sure, but that's...
All right. Well, if that's the case, then yeah.
We could pass the options dictionary to the library, and we can say, if you have a library that might have some, handler specific options that you can set, just pass this parameter in and we will use it, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Bedrock has a very similar concept of exposing features on things for with this dictionary type.
Okay. Well, based on the scenario you just described, then I agree the concrete types are probably not a good move. But the same kind of approach using a loosely typed properties bag does still seem to be viable.
Yeah, I wonder, I think it seems like the conceptual model that we all seem to like is this loose property bag, right? Where message just has a bunch of data that the handler knows how to process, right? We just don't like the user experience, right? Where nobody likes stringly typed APIs effectively, right? Or, dictionaries of key value where value is object. But maybe that's the only thing we have to fix. Maybe that's the only thing we have to try to make this more strongly typed.
Yeah, I've been playing with an API almost exactly that for networking, and I managed to make it strongly typed and a little discoverable. Let's see if I can find a link to that. Links in the chat. It takes inspiration from dependency properties in WPF as a way of handlers kind of exposing what properties they support, and then it has a strongly typed, in this case, just a try get, but there would obviously have to be a set option on. So if you look at the after portion is what I'm talking about.
So where do you see? Oh, I see. Okay. So how would that work? You would have where would the connection property key live?
That would live on the WebAssembly handler. That way you can say, properties.add WebAssemblyHandler.integrity, blah, blah, blah.
I see. But so that just, but what is the key?
So
the key is just a name, basically?
So the key is that connection property key type. And it is strongly typed, so you're not passing in just object.
Oh, I see. So your try get is generically typed on that.
Yes.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. And presumably you would, the properties collection itself would live on the message.
Yes.
It's already there, so it would just reuse the one that's there, imagine.
Already have a key value back on message?
Yeah.
We do. It's keyed on string, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. String object.
Yeah, but we could have a set options of T method that deals with populating that properties bag, but in a slightly more strongly typed manner.
Nice. Yeah, that would not be entirely horrible. It might not be very discoverable, but
amazing. But we can try to make them a little easier.
I think this is good, but it doesn't address the question of how this then composes with all the various extension methods on HTTP client and convenience methods and such. Are we saying that's not really a solvable problem, or what?
Yeah, if
Yeah,
we want to
you basically
compose, I
can't
think we
pass it
need
in,
another
right?
type. We need some sort of property bag type to be able to pass in, so that when various libraries are creating messages, they could just use that property bag and set it.
Right. Basically, I mean, that's the general downside of using, I mean, it's a bit unfortunate that on HTTP message it's typed iDictionary of string object as opposed to some custom type that derives from iDictionary of string object, because then, you don't want to have APIs take an iDictionary of string comma object, right? Ideally, you would have some sort of, I don't know, options type that use it as an implementation, and then we could define them, basically merge semantics on that type. And then people can pass the thing in, and then effectively the implementation would just say message.properties.merge, whatever you passed in, right? And then this way it would compose quite nicely. So but we could still do that, right? You could still define this type and just say on the messages this happens to be a dictionary of string object, but we could have an options type that that would define, that you could use also to define extension methods over, right? To make it a bit more nice to set.
So one benefit of having a new property bag type would be you could potentially reuse that property bag across multiple requests, whereas with the current string options dictionary, you have to set it for every request and whatever allocations that would create.
Well, I mean, you would still have, I mean, depends on how you want to do this, right? If you want to, I mean, we could do one of two things. You could just use the options type to just make it so that you can pass them in, and then still just effectively merge this guy with the underlying properties collection on the message, in which case you have to give them the same cost. It just happens for you, rather than you having to write the code by yourself. Or we could just say, screw it, we just introduce this concept on the message, and then we're a bit smarter about how we merge them. But I'm not sure we need that yet, because whether we actually allocate too much or not.
Yeah, I wouldn't be concerned about a handful of allocations, because people only do this when they're about to issue an HTTP request, and that's actual network traffic. That's going to do probably thousands of allocations anyway.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about the WebAssembly scenario, but allocations are something that kind of hurts us in other scenarios right now. If we were making sort of a generic property bag type, I would ideally prefer it to have 0 allocations or as minimal as we can get.
Or at least amortize 0, right? I think it's okay if there's a fixed cost,
Yes.
right? You just don't want to pay it per request. Yeah, so I think, so we're kind of out of time. So like, I would say core is designed with this, typed property of T seems like a workable starting point to make the thing not just a stupid key value bag. And we can extend on that and saying, okay, maybe we should have an options type that we can actually reuse across different handlers, and then the handlers themselves are just basically responsible for fishing these properties out of the request and then do whatever they need to do. I think we still have to decide what we want to do when the handler doesn't know what the property means. We could decide that it throws. We could decide that it just logs if you have a logger configured. I mean, I don't know enough to make a decision here. It's just that throwing often has the problem that it might be, you basically go out of your way to make things not work that could have worked, if that makes sense. Because it kind of depends on what the property is for, right? If it's super essential, well, then it probably, it's not that it's a hidden problem, right? The user probably can't connect to the server then, and then they realize that they have to construct the right handler.
Okay. So yeah, we are about to run out of time. But on the Blazor side, we kind of have to answer this question fairly soon, because at the moment, Pranav is doing a bunch of work to implement some of this stuff. And if we were ultimately going to be doing the property bag thing, then we wouldn't need all of the ref assembly stuff that Pranav is currently doing. So how can we try and close on this like within a matter of days?
So, I mean, I would first say, I don't know who's on the hook for this, but it would be good if, Pranav or somebody on our team, like Corey, can help you with just getting this into a shape where we think like it's a property bag that we can somehow merge with the message rather than demanding that there's a new type derived from message. It still seems you need a WebAssembly HTTP handler, though. I think that one won't go away, right? And it also seems you probably want the enums or whatever other types you actually have, because nobody wants to deal with object, right? So it seems the work is largely similar. It just means that the actual plumbing is slightly different.
Yeah,
but
okay.
it does sound like if we're going with the property bag approach, that you just need to make that work in the non-public handler implementation that we use for Blazor, and you don't need any API review before build. Like, we could make the experience better, but we don't need it now.
So you're saying that basically we don't have to construct a WebAssembly HTTP handler because there already is a hidden one that we automatically create based on where the people are running. And so instead of WebAssembly, we construct the correct one that actually can talk to the fetch APIs. And that one can just fetch the right data from the message anyway. So basically, if all the properties disappear from the handler, you don't need the type. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, then I'm not sure what you mean by no API review before build, because I mean they want to ship stable by build, right?
Well, like we could make something with if the only thing that we can ship at first is you set these magic strings, and then if we don't work out the builder / IntelliSense based experience before then, we have a working implementation. We can just make the user experience better. We're not blocking functionality. Is my point.
Sure.
There's nothing time critical. There's just time sensitive.
So if we do have some sort of new property bag type and it needs to integrate with request message, this won't work without .NET 5.
Oh, that's a good point. They need to run on 3.1. Yeah.
But if all we said in the interface is it's, I guess, yeah, if we're passing a new thing into HTTP client, post async stuff, it has now comma extra options, then we'd have needed to define that method. But again, that would mostly be a experience improvement for later, as in 5.
Yeah, is the goal for build to ship some out-of-band package that works on .NET 3.1?
Yes.
So Blazor projects target net standard 2.1, so that's even more problematic.
Yes.
I mean, from my point of view, they're not more or less problematic because both are fixed at this point, right? So like let's set up 2.1 might have fewer APIs than NetCrab 3.1 has, but both are frozen. So either way, we basically have to build stuff on top. But I mean, it seems like the strongly typed properties that Corey suggests would be workable. It basically just means you would have to have a type where these properties can live on. I don't have a strong opinion where that is. It could be just a type called WebAssembly options or something, right? And then it's a static class with just properties effectively on them. And then you would just basically say, message.properties.set effectively, right?
And how
I guess you would still have to.
So who implements this set thing? Is that going to become a new extension method in the short term, since we can't add any real members?
Yeah, I think the only way we could fit this into the current HTTP client is if that property bag or these new property types went into the existing properties dictionary.
Yeah, I agree. In which case, I'm not sure what benefit there is in having this special strongly typed way of accessing the dictionary. If you've got extension methods anyway, why wouldn't you just have HTTP request message dot set fetch options, and then you pass the fetch options instanced into it, and it deals with merging that into the property bag?
Yeah,
good point.
I think that's fine. It breaks the composability argument that we've been throwing around, though.
I don't understand why it breaks it anymore. Like ultimately, the underlying storage is a property bag in both cases, isn't it?
Yes,
yeah,
but we're talking about being able to pass this property bag to some library that constructs its own message. And if we're using the existing properties for that, then that doesn't work.
All right, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, what are the extension methods defined over, right? You probably don't want to define them over a dictionary of string, comma, object, right? You probably want to define them over message or this option type, right?
Yep.
And so it's a bit sad if we define them now over the message, because later on we have to define them over the option type. But it also doesn't seem to be the end of the world.
Okay. Well, so I guess we can't go on forever. Should we try and come up with a written proposal that describes this sort of thing, and then try and do another review, maybe start of next week or something?
Yeah, I mean, we could even do this week, right? I mean, I originally set it up for Friday, but then I think Pranav asked me to move it earlier. We could try to do another round tomorrow. I know that tomorrow most of you are busy due to some security review for Blazor, but I mean, we could do it sometime later today, so later tomorrow or Friday early morning.
Either one's fine.
We want to do it this week. I think at this point it mostly depends on how fast somebody can come up with a design proposal for the new system. Pranav, are you going to do that?
Yep.
Cool. Then just let me know when you think you will be ready, and then I will just set up another meeting for that.
All right, I can do that.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome, guys. This is great.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Right.